The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the bustling town square as cars zipped past, horns blaring impatiently. Pedestrians rushed along the sidewalks, eager to get home before dusk. In the midst of the chaos, an old woman stood motionless at the edge of the crosswalk, gripping her cane with trembling hands. She was dressed in a tattered brown coat, far too thin for the crisp autumn air. Her silver hair peeked out from beneath a faded blue scarf, and her eyes, though weathered with age, held an unreadable expression, somewhere between sorrow and urgency. People walked past her without a second glance. No one stopped. No one noticed the way her frail fingers curled anxiously around the handle of her cane, the way she shifted her weight but never moved forward, as if the street itself was an insurmountable barrier. Except for one person. 8-year-old Jake Carter, a small boy with messy brown hair and bright, curious eyes, had been standing near the crosswalk waiting for the signal to change. He had just left the corner store with a pack of bubblegum in his pocket and a pocket full of spare change from his allowance. But when he saw the woman standing there, unmoving, something tugged at his heart. His mother always told him that kindness didn't cost a thing, but it could change someone's entire day. So, without hesitation, Jake took a step forward. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said softly, looking up at her with his wide, innocent eyes. "Do you need help crossing the street?" The woman turned her head slowly, her pale blue eyes locking onto his. For a moment, she just stared at him, really stared, like she was searching for something in his face. Then, after what felt like an eternity, her lips curled into a small, warm smile. "You're a good boy," she murmured, her voice raspy yet gentle. Jake beamed. "Here," he said, reaching out his small hand, his fingers barely wrapping around hers. "I can help you." A light breeze rustled the autumn leaves along the pavement as they took slow, careful steps across the street. Jake walked beside her, his tiny frame standing firm against the occasional gusts of wind. He noticed how her hand, though wrinkled and worn, felt oddly strong, as if time had not completely stolen her strength. Cars idled at the intersection, waiting for them to pass. A few drivers looked impatient, but Jake didn't care. He focused only on getting the old woman safely to the other side. When they finally reached the curb, the woman released his hand and sighed deeply, as if shedding an invisible weight. She turned to him again, this time with something unreadable in her gaze. Was it gratitude? Amusement? Something more? She leaned down, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, young man. You have a kind heart." Jake shuffled his feet, slightly embarrassed by the attention. "It's no big deal," he said, smiling. "I just wanted to help." The woman chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Kindness is never no big deal." She paused, then reached into the folds of her coat and pulled out something small, pressing it into Jake's hand. Jake glanced down and frowned. It was a key, an old tarnished key attached to a delicate silver chain. There was something oddly familiar about it, though he couldn't quite place why. Confused, he looked back up at the woman to ask what it was for, but she was gone. Jake spun around, scanning the street. There was no sign of her, no glimpse of the faded blue scarf, no trace of her frail figure disappearing into the crowd. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. His heart pounded in his chest. "Jake!" His mother's voice broke through his daze. He turned to see her standing a few feet away, holding the grocery bag she had just picked up from the store. "Who are you talking to?" Jake opened his palm and stared at the key again, its cool metal pressing against his skin. Something about it felt important. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But she gave me this." His mother's eyes flickered to the object in his hand. At first she looked mildly confused, but then, suddenly, her face paled. The color drained from her cheeks as she took an unsteady step forward. "Jake?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Where did you get that?" Jake's brows furrowed. "I told you, the old lady gave it to me. I helped her cross the street and she just disappeared." His mother swallowed hard. "Jake," she said, her voice barely above a breath. "This key, it belongs to your great-grandfather, and it's been missing for over 70 years." Jake's heart skipped a beat. What had just happened? And more importantly, who was that old woman? Jake's mother, Emily Carter, stood frozen, staring at the key in her son's hand like it was some kind of ghost. "This belonged to your great-grandfather," she repeated, her voice trembling. "But that's impossible. It was lost decades ago." Jake's curiosity burned brighter. He held the key up to the fading sunlight, turning it between his fingers. It was old, the edges worn and slightly rusted. But there was something almost magical about it. A single word was etched into the handle, faint yet still legible. Holloway. His mother sucked in a sharp breath. "Oh my God," she whispered. "What?" Jake asked. "What's Holloway?" Emily hesitated, as if deciding how much to say. Finally, she exhaled, placing a hand on Jake's shoulder. "It was the name of your great-grandfather's estate," she said. "A mansion. A home that's been abandoned for years. No one in the family has set foot in it since before I was born." Jake blinked. "Wait, you mean like a real haunted house?" Emily didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked down at the key again, her expression unreadable. "Come on," she said finally. "We're going to see Grandma." Jake sat in the back seat as his mom drove to his grandmother's house, gripping the key tightly. The strange encounter with the old woman replayed in his head on a loop. The way she had vanished. The way she had spoken, as if she knew something he didn't. By the time they pulled up to his grandmother's small white house, the sky was darkening and Jake's anticipation had reached its peak. His grandmother, Margaret Carter, was a sharp-eyed woman in her late 70s, always carrying an air of quiet wisdom. When she opened the door and saw Emily's pale face, she frowned. "What's wrong?" she asked immediately. Emily didn't say anything. Instead, she simply held out the key. Margaret took one look at it and gasped. She nearly dropped it, her wrinkled hands trembling as she clutched it tightly. "Where?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "Where did you get this?" Jake swallowed hard. "I helped an old lady cross the street," he said. "She gave it to me, and then she disappeared." Margaret didn't speak for several seconds. When she finally looked up, her eyes shimmered with something between fear and wonder. "We have to go to Holloway," she said firmly. The drive to the Holloway estate was long, the road winding and overgrown, leading further away from the town than Jake had ever been. With each passing mile, the trees grew denser, their gnarled branches stretching out like twisted fingers in the darkness. Finally, they arrived at a set of towering iron gates, rusted and covered in ivy. Beyond them, a massive, decaying mansion loomed in the moonlight, its once grand architecture now worn by time. Jake shivered. The place looked like something straight out of a horror movie. "This was our family's home?" he asked, disbelief creeping into his voice. Margaret nodded. "It was beautiful once," she murmured, "before everything happened." Jake turned to her. "Before what happened?" Margaret hesitated before answering. "Your great-grandfather, Theodore Holloway, was a very wealthy man," she said, "but he had enemies. One night he vanished without a trace, and all of his wealth, the family fortune, was never found. The estate was abandoned, and our family was forced to leave. No one ever found out what happened to him. Or the treasure." Jake's breath caught. "Treasure?" Margaret nodded. "Rumors say he left everything hidden somewhere in this house. But without the key, no one could find it." Jake's heart pounded as he turned to the gates. The key in his pocket felt heavier now, almost like it was pulling him forward. "We need to go inside," he said. Emily bit her lip, exchanging a wary glance with her mother. But finally, she nodded. "Let's do this." Jake's fingers trembled as he lifted the key to the rusted lock on the mansion's front door. It clicked open smoothly, as if waiting all these years for his touch. The door creaked loudly as it swung inward, revealing a grand but crumbling foyer. A massive chandelier hung precariously from the ceiling, dust coating every surface. The air was thick with the scent of old wood, decay, and something else, something familiar. Jake took a hesitant step inside. The floorboards groaned beneath his sneakers. "Where do we even start?" he asked. Margaret walked forward, eyes scanning the room like she was remembering something long buried. Then she stopped. "The fireplace," she whispered. Jake followed her gaze. At the far end of the room stood an enormous marble fireplace, its intricate carvings barely visible under layers of dust. "Your great-grandfather always said that if anything ever happened to him," Margaret murmured, "the answers would be in the fire." Emily frowned. "What does that mean?" Jake, however, was already moving. He crouched in front of the fireplace and ran his hands along the stone. At first, nothing happened. Then, click. One of the bricks shifted under his touch. Jake's breath hitched. He pushed harder, and suddenly a hidden compartment slid open. Inside was an aged, leather-bound journal and something else. A sealed letter with the words, "For the one who finds the key," scrawled on the front. With shaking hands, Margaret picked up the letter and opened it. As she read, her eyes filled with tears. "What does it say?" Emily asked anxiously. Margaret took a deep breath, then read aloud. "If you are reading this, it means my time has passed, but my hope remains. My enemies have come for me, and I may not escape them. But the truth must live on. The key you hold unlocks more than just this house. It holds the proof of a great betrayal. The fortune I once had was taken from me, hidden away by those who sought to erase our family's name. If you wish to reclaim what is rightfully ours, follow the map within this journal. It will lead you to the truth. But beware, some secrets do not wish to be found." Silence filled the room. Jake's heart was racing. A map? A hidden treasure? A betrayal? This was turning into an adventure beyond his wildest dreams. Emily exhaled shakily. "What do we do?" Margaret wiped at her eyes, steeling herself. "We finish what Theodore started." Jake's eyes gleamed. For the first time, he felt something stir deep inside him, a connection to his family's past, to a mystery left unsolved for generations. The old woman's words echoed in his mind. Kindness never goes unrewarded. Little did Jake know their journey was only just beginning. The air inside Holloway Mansion felt heavier now, thick with secrets and the weight of history pressing down on them. Jake's heart pounded as Margaret turned the fragile pages of the journal, revealing the long-lost map hidden inside. The map was hand-drawn, yellowed with age, showing the entire layout of the estate. But one marking stood out, a bold red X scribbled inside what appeared to be a hidden basement beneath the mansion. Emily frowned, running her fingers over the parchment. "I don't remember Grandpa Theodore ever mentioning a basement," she said. Margaret's eyes darkened. "That's because we were never meant to find it." A slow chill crept up Jake's spine. "But we have now," he whispered. With renewed determination, they followed the map's directions to the far end of the house, into what was once the grand dining hall. Dust-covered furniture stood frozen in time, an eerie silence filling the air. Margaret led them to the far wall, where, according to the map, a secret door should be hidden. Jake pressed his hands along the aged wood paneling. Click. A small section of the wall shifted slightly. Emily gasped. They had found it. Together they pried the panel open, revealing a narrow stone staircase leading downward into darkness. A musty, cold air drifted up from below, sending shivers down Jake's spine. "Be careful," Margaret warned. "Whatever's down there has been buried for a reason." Jake swallowed his fear and descended first, gripping the old railing tightly. Margaret and Emily followed close behind. The deeper they went, the colder the air became, as if they were stepping into another time. Finally, they reached the bottom, and Margaret flicked on the flashlight she had brought. The beam illuminated a small underground chamber, its walls lined with crumbling bricks. In the center of the room stood an ancient wooden chest. Jake's breath caught. The fortune! This was it! Emily rushed forward and carefully unlatched the rusted lock. With a deep breath, she lifted the heavy lid. Inside, nothing. Jake's stomach dropped. "What?" he whispered, staring at the empty space. But the letter said? Margaret's hands trembled as she reached inside. Her fingers brushed against something small and delicate, a folded piece of paper. Emily unfolded it, her eyes darting over the handwritten message. Her face went pale. What does it say? Jake asked urgently. Emily's voice shook as she read aloud. To the one who finds this, I am sorry. There was never a fortune. The real treasure of the Holloway family was never gold or riches. It was something far more valuable. Margaret gasped. No, she whispered, covering her mouth. Jake blinked in confusion. What does that mean? Emily turned to face him, her expression unreadable. Then, in a trembling voice, she spoke words that shook Jake's entire world. Jake, our family was never poor. His mind reeled. But you said we lost everything when great-grandpa Theodore disappeared. Margaret let out a shaky breath, tears welling in her eyes. That's what we were told, but now, I think we were lied to. Emily held up the note. The great betrayal wasn't about a missing fortune, it was about a stolen legacy. Jake's pulse raced. His entire family history was built on a lie. Margaret wiped at her eyes. Someone erased our name from history, made sure we would never know the truth. She looked up at them, determination hardening in her gaze. But now we have the proof. Jake felt his world tilt on its axis. Everything he thought he knew about his family, about who he was, had just changed in an instant. But one question still burned in his mind. Who had given him the key? As if answering his thoughts, a soft gust of air brushed against his cheek. A whisper of a voice, gentle, warm, and familiar, echoed in the chamber. Kindness never goes unrewarded. Jake's breath hitched. His hands clenched around the key. He turned back toward the stairs, and for the briefest second in the dim glow of the flashlight, he saw her. The old woman, standing at the top of the staircase, her blue scarf fluttering ever so slightly, before fading into nothing. Jake's heart pounded as realization dawned. She wasn't just an old woman. She had been watching over their family all along, and she had brought them back home,